Girl meets boy, girl gets hired to write his cookbook, sparks fly. In other words, things get steamy. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today I'm joined with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hello, Kate.
Molly, I've probably asked you this before, but have you ever wanted to write a novel?
I wrote some short stories once, long ago.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly studied creative writing and thought of writing fiction, whether I was specific enough to think it would be a novel, but sure, probably. But I've never actually tried to write a novel. Now, Kate, you are writing a novel. You've written a novel. You're trying to write it.
That's the problem with writing a novel. It's like you don't really know. I can't say I have written. I mean, I have gotten to the end, but now I'm in that process of like some days I'm like, oh yeah, this is really working. And other days I'm like, this is just a heaping load of just words on a page and I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I think the emotional roller coaster of writing fiction has been sort of this eye-opening thing for me, but it's also really gratifying. I mean, like once you start, I can see why people just want to keep going. I want to keep going.
In this novel, is there food?
There is food. It's a mystery. One of the characters is a chef, but I wouldn't say food is at like the heart of the story, but it's there.
I love it because I think you and I in particular often talk about how when we both read a lot of fiction, right? And depending on the genre, when there's food in it, if the food is not accurately portrayed, it's a bit of a bugaboo. It's like, yes. I was going along, I was believing the story, I was digging this book, and then there's that darn persimmon or whatever it is.
Out of the story completely.
Right. Or a restaurant scene that doesn't feel true.
Right.
So really excited about today's episode because we're talking to a novelist. Romance is the genre, but it's all about food.
It really is. Sarah Chamberlain, she's from the Bay Area. She lives in London, but she has a lot of a background in cookbooks, which we'll ask her about. But you can tell reading her novel, The Slowest Burn, that she understands food and flavor and how important that is to just life.
Yeah.
It's not like a superfluous. Sometimes I think in fiction, if a character is really into, eating certain foods, they can seem fussy. Mm-hmm. It's not seen as a positive.
Disordered eating. Part of an emotional trauma or something.
Right. Or there's no food.
Yeah. Some listeners might wonder why we were a romance novelist as a guest on Everything Cookbooks, but it's because the story, Sarah, well, first of all, as you said, Sarah's got a big background in cookbooks. She loves cookbooks. She's got this huge collection, but more so, she has worked as a cookbook translator, which we're going to talk to her about and find out what that really is. Right. But the story itself, there's a ghostwriter and a chef.
Right. If you, believe in write what you know, this is a really good version of that. So I'll give you a little bit of the flap copy. Ellie, she's a ghostwriter. Her life is neat and tidy. She's a widow and she lives in the bungalow behind her in-laws. So she gets paired to be the ghostwriter for this up-and-coming chef named Kieran, who just won basically this huge reality television show.
Right. An agent approaches him because he's a hot ticket right now.
Yep.
And they're like, oh, dude, you got to write a book. He says yes, of course.
Right.
But he doesn't know what the book is. And so the two of them are paired up and they are a very unlikely pair.
Exactly.
But because it's romance, there's no spoiler here.
Right.
We know what's going to happen.
We know it's going to be a happily ever after. But the trick about romance is that you don't know how you're going to get there. And the best ones make it so unlikely that they're going to find their path together at the end. And they take you on that journey. All good novels have that sense of mystery. It's fun, it's steamy, and it really gets food right.
I read it. I loved it.
Let's bring her on to talk about it. Sarah, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So we are really looking forward to diving into your book. But before we do that, when Molly and I introduced you, we mentioned that you were a cookbook translator. And I know a lot of our listeners are going to think, whoa, what is a cookbook translator? So what does that mean? Like, what kinds of books did you work on?
I work with British authors whose books are being published into the US or in general, British recipes that are being published for an American audience. The big difference is around measurements, where the Brits use metric and Americans use, well, the Brits call it imperial. I think we call it English for whatever reason. So there's measurement differences, but there's also spelling, grammar, vocabulary. There are ingredients that British recipes use that Americans find difficult, if not impossible to get. Differences in how we cut up meat, differences in the fish that's available in the ocean, that kind of stuff. So I do all of that to rework the book. And I've worked with authors like Diana Henry, Mira Soda. I've worked on the newest LaRousse guide for cocktails. I was a consultant for conversion for the UK Guardian's recipe app, which they were going to release.
Wow.
So you're Americanizing recipes.
That is correct. That's exactly the word.
It's fascinating to me on so many levels. Are you hired by the authors or the publishers?
I am usually hired by the publisher. With Diana Henry, my contact was in the UK with Octopus, who published into the States. With Mira's book East, I was working directly with Flatiron, who are her American publisher.
But will you go back and forth with an author if there are questions like around corn flour or an ingredient or a cut of meat? Can you then work with the author to come up with a suitable substitute or workaround?
Yes, exactly. So there's a ridiculous Google Doc somewhere in the depths of my computer with Mira and I just going back and forth about conversions and measurements and sort of negotiating things back and forth about what's accurate and what's not. So yeah, it is definitely a conversation with the author. The joys of modern technology, it's actually made it so much easier to communicate this stuff.
Right.
Like I remember at one point with Diana, I was trying to talk to her about a recipe where she called for medium aubergines or eggplants. I was just like, what do you think a medium aubergine weighs? And she said, like, I don't know, like 250, 300 grams. And I went to I was in the grocery store and had been texting with her. And I took a photograph of an eggplant. And it's like, the smallest eggplant I can buy in this supermarket weighs a pound or 450 grams.
Right.
So we're going to need to rethink this. Yeah. And the response I got back to her was just a string of swear words. Whoa, what?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it's communicating. There's just stuff that's not obvious when you're in a room 6,000 miles away that is obvious when you're in the supermarket in the States.
And imagine, depending on the book, just thinking about the scope of the project and how long something like that would take. I guess it depends on the book.
It depends on the book. It depends on how thorough the publisher is asking me to be as well. For example, with some books, I'm asked to retest. Some books I'm not. Some books it's just a straight conversion job where I'm just working through the recipe and typing it up. With another book, the editor asked me specifically, it's like, are there recipes that you think you need to retest? And so I read through the book really closely and I handed back a list of about 15 recipes that I said, like, I think these won't work as written. We need to retest. One of the biggest ones I can think of, for example, is the Brits can buy ready-made puff pastry dough that's fresh in blocks. So you can work with it like if you made it yourself and you can roll it and treat it any which way you want. Here you can only get the frozen sheets. So I sort of looked at this as like, we need to retest it with frozen sheets because for the sake of timing, because I looked at the recipe as written and said, like, I'm worried we're risking we're either going to burn it or it's going to be raw, and I'm not sure what the deal with this is going to be. So that's the kind of thing I do.
That's really fascinating. What about self-rising flour? What do you do with that situation?
I will usually give instructions for the way of making it yourself where you add, oh God, I'm blanking on whether it's baking soda or baking powder. Please don't fire me.
Leavenings.
Where you add a proportion of leavening to all-purpose to make self-rising. Because I think there are certain parts of the country that you can buy self-rising. I think like in the South it's available, but just in other places it's not. It depends on people's tolerance, because you can say to people as well, like, you can buy pretty much anything online that's a dry good. So saying to someone self-rising flour, it's like, if you have the time and the patience, you can get this delivered to your home, but you can also just quickly make it yourself following these proportions.
Okay, we really do want to get to your book. But how did you get, but I just think this is a very interesting sort of field. How did you get into becoming a cookbook translator?
Bluffing is the short answer to that question.
Okay, I like it.
I had been an avid home cook for years. and I had lived in the UK for a long time. Through my interest in food, I'd ended up running a food festival about 11 years ago. And through that, I had met Diana Henry. I'd moved back to the States and seen American editions of British cookbooks and flipped through them and gone, I know for a fact that that's wrong, that wasn't done correctly. So I was back in London. I was seeing Diana for lunch, and I asked her, it's like, who runs your Americanization? And she just said, a person, I don't think they do a great job. I looked at her, it's like, do you think I could do it? And she looked at me and she's like, yeah, I think you could do it. And she recommended me to her publisher. And that's how I got my first job. It was terrifying because I literally, like I was saying, like I had done copy editing previously, to be fair. I had copy editing experience, so I wasn't totally out of nowhere with this. But it was purely just me saying, like, I'm a good copy editor. I know a lot about cooking, and I've lived in both places, and I understand both systems of measurement.
And you love cookbooks.
And I love cookbooks.
Well, and I think that's such a great segue to talk about The Slowest Burn. So it's your debut novel. So much about the food world is in this book, and it really comes across that you know what you're talking about. You know, somebody comes out with a debut novel and you're thinking maybe they spent a year on it and it's out like the next year, but there's like years that go into this. So just take us back a little bit and tell us how you started getting into writing romances.
I started as a reader first. I particularly got into reading romance in November 2016 when Trump got elected and my social media turned into one long primal scream. And I looked at this like, I can't look at this. I can't bear it. I need to consume something that actually makes me feel optimistic. And I remembered that my mother had really avidly read Susan Elizabeth Phillips, who's a very prestigious romance writer. And I just went on Kindle and I blew a lot of money on Susan Elizabeth Phillips' backlist and blitzed through them all in about 3 weeks, and then dug up, I think my next one was American-ize. I went and downloaded her whole backlist and read it all and just totally fell in love with it. And then that was sort of, I guess, the beginning of the rock going down the hill. And what really sped things up is I found out about the romance writer Sarah McLean, who writes brilliant historical romance. She has a master list on her website of romance recommendations across all the subgenres. And I just treated that like Romance 101, picked out ones I like the sound of and went through it. So I've been reading them since 2016. And then in early 2019, I had the idea to write one myself. That's not the book that's getting published, but I did write that book, which was my first time writing fiction ever. Period. But I just been reading them enough that I thought I knew what I was doing. And I went out and queried agents, and I didn't get an agent for that book, but they said enough encouraging things as they rejected me that I thought I might be onto something here. So I went on some writing retreats. I started working on another book, but then I had the idea for The Slowest Burn, and it had been sort of in the back of my mind. And through one of these writers' workshops, I met an agent, and this would have been October 20. And I had a phone call with her, and she said, look, the original thing you sent to me, you're a great writer, but it's not commercial enough. Do you have other ideas?
When somebody says something isn't commercial enough, because I think writers face this all the time, but sometimes we think something's commercial and then we don't realize that it's not until we've gone down a rabbit hole for a while. So what makes something commercial?
The phrase that publishing people throw around is high concept, where it's basically you should be able to sum it up in one or two really punchy sentences. Have you heard of there's a new Netflix series called Nobody Wants This?
Yes.
Kristen Bell and Adam Brady. Very neatly summed up by Gentile sex podcaster falls in love with a rabbi. That's immediately a story where you're just like, tell me more. This is intriguing. And having something that's commercial enough, it's the kind of idea that makes someone sit forward and say, tell me more.
Interesting.
I see. You have this story. It's quiet. It's not punchy enough. It's not high concept, but you have this other idea. What was the original idea for The Slowest Burn?
It was pretty much the premise that you see now. It was a newly minted celebrity chef who is Chaos Muppet, is paired up with cookbook ghostwriter who is Order Muppet, and they fight and flirt and fall in love over 8 months of writing his debut cookbook.
Was it hard to walk away from I don't want to say the failed book, but your first novel?
Right.
Was it hard to leave that behind and start something new?
It's a good question. I didn't find it that way. I think because I had actually been agented before for nonfiction work and not had those projects go anywhere. So I wasn't a stranger to rejection.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I could see being much more protective of it if that had been my first ever rejection on a big piece of work, but it wasn't. But I think as well, I saw it as a rung on a ladder where I wrote that book. I learned a lot from doing it, and there was stuff from it that I could take forward to write something better next time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's a really good lesson to learn. When you were writing nonfiction, was it a food-focused subject matter that you were working toward?
There were two proposals. The first one was a food history proposal because I am basically a frustrated food historian, if we're going to be totally honest. I wanted to write something about a post-war history of food in the UK because no one had really tackled it, and also particularly tackling untold stories and stories from underrepresented groups. The proposal was strong enough to get me an agent, but then my agent tried to sell it and had no joy. And then I was working on a second proposal about women and muscle and strength because my hobby is that I'm a power lifter. And I realized there just wasn't a lot written about women's experiences of getting physically strong. And I wanted to write something about that. I ended up parting ways with my agent over it, tried to get another agent, no luck. That was the point I was at when I wrote my first romance novel. I was in the point of just frustration with trying and failing to get traction with nonfiction work.
Yeah.
That's really important that you just kept going.
It's interesting because one of our most popular episodes is we did one on rejection and recovery, and it's something we just don't talk that much about. And anybody who's seen any success, certainly in publishing, has stories and stories of rejection.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, and life is not straightforward, and people I'm very lucky and privileged in the circumstances that I have the option to sort of get up, dust myself up and try again. But it's also, I wanted it. I wanted it really badly, and it just made me stubborn.
It's so interesting to hear this, Sarah, and reading The Slowest Burn, which I'm afraid we'll try not to give too many spoilers, but they might come out. So but it's worth reading, even if we tell you a little bit more what it's about. But the food is so central in this book. And I would say from the start that I don't read a lot of romance, and it's a genre that I'm not very familiar with. So I sat down to read. I was like, okay, here, try this because I wanted to be ready to talk to you. But the food is so good throughout, and not just the food, but the publishing journey. Your knowledge, and I don't want to say it's a pet peeve, but sometimes we've joked on this podcast about when you're reading along in fiction and it's a great book, but they get the food wrong, it loses you. And obviously food is so central to this, but your depth, and it's interesting, like when the chef, Kieran,
yes,
he talks about his history, training in France, and it's so specific and so believable. It's like you get it on so many levels, I gotta say.
I've been very lucky to be part of the sort of food community, I guess, in London for a very long time, from the festival that I started when I was a baby. I was 25. So I've met a lot of people through doing that. And food people love food people. We can just sit around and natter for hours about restaurants we've eaten at and things we've cooked and things we've read that we're really excited about. So having been surrounded by that community, that then went into the book. So a lot of the stuff I know is both from having done it for my job, but also just the people I have been friends with for years now and who have taught me so much about what goes into running a restaurant and writing a cookbook and all of that kind of thing.
Let's talk about one of the scenes early in the book. So essentially, you have Ellie, the ghostwriter, and she's going to work with Kieran to write this book. And as somebody who's been in this situation before, it was like, oh my God, I felt like there was a lot of things I related to with the poor suffering ghostwriter who's kind of frustrated. The chef's late. He has ADHD. He's not very organized about, certain things. He doesn't even know what he wants his cookbook to be about. But then you have these really great specifics about the food in the scene. Molly, let's just talk about the scene in the restaurant where Kieran is working and he is putting together this menu that he just thinks is going to take him to the next level. And she eats it and she's just like, this is terrible. I hate it. She
gets angry. Yeah.
She gets angry.
And it's one of those tasting menus that we've all been to. And they're just, you leave, you got to go order a pizza when you get home because you're so hungry and you're angry because it's been one little canapé after. I think there's a quail leg and it's this high concept, not satisfying. There's no comfort in it. And they have a big blow up in the restaurant that's causes this big scene.
Was that based on anything? Or was it based on a meal you had? I'm really curious.
Yes, it definitely was. Let's protect the guilty,
Sure.
shall we? I got taken along as a guest to a really, really fancy tasting menu in San Francisco. This would have been back in 2013. This was a meal that I think it was, as written, had 13 courses. They kept adding new freebies because my friend was press. So they were throwing in lots of stuff on top. And there were wine pairings. I mean, we'd slightly blown it because we'd been to a bar right before and had a drink beforehand. So we were already behind. And guys, it was carnage. It was so bad because there's like, you just get inundated with all this elaborate, rich, over manipulated food, and just the pleasure just totally went out of it. And we had to beg them to stop. We were reaching the point where like, we are too full. There is too much booze. Our palates are just overwhelmed. And they're just like, oh, just a few more things. And it's like, they brought 2 more things. And it's like, we have to stop. And I have never felt so sick to my stomach as when I was leaving the restaurant. It's like, when you're so full, it's like, I can't breathe because it feels like my stomach is pressing on my diaphragm and my lungs. And I had to like storm into a Walgreens and like pour Tums down my throat. I didn't leave that meal hungry. I left that meal simultaneously overfed and unsatisfied, which was a real downer. But yeah, that was certainly the meal I was thinking about, where it was more about the performance and I suspect about the chef's ego than it was about any pleasurable experience that we were supposed to have.
I think we've all had that disconnect where, the chef hasn't sat through and eaten these things all back to back. I mean, I think it's kind of like when people maybe write a first draft of a book and they haven't sat down to read it all the way through, and they think, oh, you're supposed to enjoy this, but maybe not. So so tell us a little bit, like, what is your writing process like?
My writing process is, I treat the first draft as like, if I were to use the metaphor of like making a sculpture, I'm not even trying to carve the sculpture yet. I'm just going up the mountain and trying to carve out the rock that I'm going to use to make the statue. It's basically throwing lots of stuff onto the page, writing lots of scenes. I'm not saying I'm improvising it. I know the approximate structure that it needs to follow because romance has a very strict system of beats that you have to meet to make it a romance. So I follow that, but I throw lots of stuff into the middle. When I go back to it in the second and the third drafts, that's when I'm actually carving it into shape. I'll throw a lot of stuff out. I'll realize I left a hole in this particular place. And that's when I sort of start to like form it into something. And when I look at it and go, I think I'm kind of done forming this and I need help refining it, that's when it goes to my editor. And my editor sends me the dreaded editor's letter, which I read and then have to kind of sit in my feelings about for at least a week. And then I can go on and do another round of editing.
Did you learn the beats, as you say, the pacing, the cadence of romance both through reading and also through these workshops?
I would say more through reading. My workshops, the first workshop I went to was an excellent one, but that was much more about writers getting together and sharing their work. The second workshop I was in was much more about like the nature of writing a novel, but that wasn't helpful because no one else in my course wrote romance or read it. And so I would get these comments back that were just like, you're asking me about things that I know are obvious because I read in the genre, but you're treating them like they're cheesy or cliche or weird. And it's like, that's not true. But no, I mostly know the beats from writing. And I mean, I think most people know the beats, even if they don't read romance, because if you've seen a movie by Nora Ephron, you can probably, if I say to you, like, there's sort of the meet cute, there's the point where they're kind of feeling each other out and trying to get to know each other. And then there's the point where it's like, oh, are they going to tip over into being romantic? And then there's usually the lowest possible moment when it seems like all is lost and how are these people ever going to get together? And then there's the big reconciliation at the end.
Right. You have to have a happily ever after.
And there's sex.
Yes.
So having not read a lot of romance, the sex, it's not there at the beginning and it comes, and Kate and I were talking about this when we were talking about the book. We were both, I'm not going to say surprised by it, but all of a sudden I was like, oh, it got steamy. And is that, I don't know, is it 2/3 of the way? It's pretty far into it. And is that something that you find in romance?
Or is that part of the title? Because the slowest burn, I wondered if there was a tie-in with that pacing.
Yes, so there's a concept in romance called the slow burn,
Ah.
which is the characters are attracted to each other and they're getting close and getting far and getting close and getting far until eventually this happens. But sex on page isn't a requirement. One of the best romance writers I know is a British writer named Mary
I
McFarlane.
love her. So good.
She's wonderful. Her stuff is closed door,
Oh, yeah.
but you don't think about it because she writes such tremendous banter with amazing tension and heat that you don't mind not seeing the characters getting down on page because you know exactly how hot they're going to be together. She doesn't need to tell you.
Mm.
Also, there are writers that are much more explicit than me. I am sort of kind of middle of the road in how I write sex scenes. But yeah, I think I didn't know what I was going to do with that until I did it. And I kind of figured out as I wrote, it's like, this is what my comfortable level is. So the decision's like, I am going to put explicit sex on page, but I don't want it to be like super, super nitty gritty. That's the style I've ended up landing on. And that's a very comfortable place for me to write.
You know, it's not out of balance with I mean, there's so many elements to this story. Did you know the two-person narrative that you alternate the chapters between his perspective and her perspective? Was that a device you knew going in, or is that something that you came up with in the process of crafting the structure?
In this particular book, having both of them speak was right from the beginning. I could hear both of them in my head. Their voices came to me. Kieran's voice actually came to me first, and then Ellie's followed after a few weeks. So yeah, I wanted both of them to speak because they come from such different places that we need sort of their perceptions of each other to sort of weave in and out for the story to make sense. But I've had other stories where, like my second book, I really thought for the longest time it was going to be single point of view because I couldn't hear the male main character. He just wasn't speaking. Everything I was getting was through the female main character's perspective. And I thought I was trying to make myself fine with that. But then finally I just had a blink of inspiration and I wrote a scene from his perspective and I went, that's his voice. That's what I can do. And that moved forward. But it just takes time for that to come together.
Right. Just so our listeners get a taste of your writing, I wanted to read just a paragraph from page 79. This is just a great premise. So we didn't talk yet about how Kieran got famous. Like he was on sort of like Top Chef kind of show, like a fictionalized version of Top Chef, maybe?
It is Top Chef, but
right.
not Top Chef.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. Not Top Chef, but in the fictional world of Top Chef, that's where he gets his acclaim. So he gives Ellie a challenge. So they're kind of like at this point where they're still prickly with each other. You know, she's like, you can't do what I do. And she's like, well, you can't do what I do. And so he gives her this challenge of like, okay, you have like 30 minutes and you've got to cook with broccoli, apples, and Parmesan, and you have to make something.
Yeah.
And just the way you write about it shows your knowledge of food and flavor. So this is from Ellie's perspective. I cut a tiny piece off of one of the apples, mostly sweet, a little tart. The broccoli was the opposite, green and bitter from chlorophyll. How could I get them to meet in the middle? The salt and funk of the Parmesan would highlight the differences between the broccoli and the apples, and they'd fight with each other more. I needed to make the apples more like a vegetable or the broccoli more like a fruit. So I'm just curious, like when you're writing, is that something that's coming to you? Is it something that you've eaten before that you're drawing from? Like where are these ideas coming from?
I think that was almost me trying to think of like what would be something that I would find really hard to do and like stuff that's really hard to cohere. So that's, I think, based off like all of my cooking and cookbook work experience. It's something that sounds plausible, but anyone who knows anything about cooking will read that and go like, that's really hard to do. I don't know how you're going to pull that off. So yeah, it comes from my experience. But again, hi, frustrated food writer over here. So yeah.
I like this outlet though. You're able to like channel that into your novel.
Right.
And so well.
But it brings a specificity to the page that makes us, you know, like any good fiction, it takes us there. And especially for someone who's food centric, I knew exactly what she was wrestling with. And then it's also interesting, Sarah, hearing you talk about how you learned to write that was really through experience and through self-taught. And Ellie as well is a self-taught cook. There's certain autobiographical elements in her experience, it seems.
I think that is definitely true. For the record, Ellie is not me.
Oh, understood.
But there's a great quote by a British author named Caleb Azuma Nelson. I heard him speak and he said something, my writing is not autobiographical, but my writing is personal. It's like, it's personal that like, a lot of my concerns and my bugbears and things that I just find myself chewing over a lot go into that. And one of the things I find myself thinking about is like, how do people become cooks? And if you think of Ellie, who is self-taught, who just figured out stuff initially just because she had to, and was working with cookbooks from the library and just figured a lot of things out, and then had her mother-in-law teacher eventually start to teach her stuff, and she just started to pick up things wherever she could, versus Kieran, who is actually, for all his chaos, Kieran's trained. Kieran has a culinary arts degree. Kieran's come up through restaurant kitchens, which are much more restrictive and structured. Her upbringing was much more chaotic than his. So they come to this interesting place where there's like a confluence where on the surface, it looks like she's like the very orderly, controlled one, and he is like all chaos and mess. But it's so much more complicated than that. And people are so much more complex than we give them credit for.
And another thing that's complex about your writing here is that you're talking about these two people coming together, working on a book together. So that meant you also had to have a book in a book. So that's another layer of like specificity. So I know in your acknowledgments, you talk a little bit about that. Tell us the story of like how you figured out that element.
So in the first draft, I was very vague about the cookbook because I didn't know what the cookbook was, but I gave the book to a developmental editor to look at. I didn't want a repeat of the, your writing is great, but not good enough. I want it to be at its best possible mode. So I hired a developmental editor named Heather Lazar. She came back to me and said, Sarah, what's the cookbook? And I sat there and I said, like, oh, fiddlesticks. Okay, I have to do this now. So I sat there and I just chewed on it and I sketched and I sketched. And I finally went and stood in front of my cookbook shelf and I saw a copy of Crave by Ed Smith, who is a British writer who came up through food blogging. He has a blog called Rocket and Squash. But I looked at that, and Crave is based on the principle of what you feel like eating in a given moment. And I looked at that and said, that is so Kieran. It's got to be that. So I just took the concept, reworded it, and then came up with recipes that would sort of fit into it, not the same recipes that are in Crave. The real fun thing was I went ahead and I did this. And it was only when it's like, oh, this book is going to be published. And I sat there, it's like, I never talked to Ed about this, did I? So I had to go to Ed. And it's like, this is me asking forgiveness instead of permission. And bless him, he was fine. He was really totally fine with it. He was actually kind of flattered. But yeah, it was, I found the concept I needed amongst my ridiculous cookbook collection and ran with it.
It's so interesting. And so because hearing that, I can't imagine this story working without it, because the title of the book within the book that Kieran and Ellie are writing is Whatever You Want. And that is this moment of progression in their relationship, both professionally and personally. Landing on the concept of the cookbook they're writing is so important to the development of the whole story. And then underlying that, it's also key to this element we were talking about before with that overwrought chef tasting menu, about the importance of comfort in food and pleasure in all things that runs through this. And this sort of there's messages of body positivity in this too. There's a lot of that sort of comfort. I just want to use that word, which is so tied to this book that they're working on. And one of the things, when Kate and I were talking, we were wondering if Whatever You Want, the cookbook they're writing, is that a little bit of a nod to how tired we all are of chef cookbooks?
We're tired of chef cookbooks, but I think we've come into a place, I think maybe post-pandemic particularly, where everyone's just like, oh God, I have to eat, but I'm so tired. And there's just been this burst suddenly of cookbooks that are just like, we are here for you. Here's stuff that you can make when you're tired, you can't be bothered. So I suppose it kind of fits in with that. But I think you're absolutely right with the idea of where it links into pleasure and comfort. Because I think one of the key things about Ellie and the journey that she goes on is that she is someone who is totally disconnected from her own wants and desires because she's taking care of everyone else except herself. And the big journey that she goes on is to feel like she can express what she wants and the world won't end. And most likely she can get it if she asks the right person. I think that is part of it. I think it wasn't something I meant to do at the time. It's only something when I came to the end, it's like, I see what I've done there. Well done, me.
Were the chapters in Crave, did Ed also have there's the Revive chapter, was there the Seduce?
No, everything was renamed.
Yeah.
Everything was renamed and restructured. What I took from Crave was just the core, the one sentence concept was there, and all of the reformatting I did on my own.
Such a good idea, though. I mean, I'm kind of thinking, oh, shoot, I guess that book already exists because it's a great idea for a book.
Yeah, it's very well done.
So you get this book to a point where you send it to a developmental editor. And this is after you've already signed with your current agent.
No, before. I didn't want to end up in the close but no cigar place. I wanted to have the best chance possible for an agent to say yes.
I was just curious the process, how long it took you from conception to getting to, say, that developmental edit.
Well, in the interest of transparency, it was the pandemic and everything was on fire in California. I could not leave my house. Right. I didn't have much else to do. I wrote the first draft in 5 months, and then I edited myself for, I would say, another 3 months. And that's when I sent it to the developmental editor. She handed it back 2-ish months later. I sat with her edits, paralyzed for a little while, in all honesty, because when you get inundated by so much constructive criticism, all you can kind of do is go, right, for a little bit. And then you eventually get on to actually doing the editing you need to do. So I was finally ready after another 6 months. I started writing the book in November 2020, and I started querying agents in February 2022.
That's a pretty good pace, though. It's one thing to get to the end of a book, but it's another thing to revise it and polish it and make sure it's as good as possible. I mean, that's where I am right now, and it's terrifying, the whole process.
It's terrifying, but you also just I think it's one where there's I think it's Voltaire. It's not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Good point.
The point at which it goes to someone else is the point where you look at this and say, maybe it needs more. I don't know what it needs, though. And that's the point where you can say, I can't touch this anymore. And it could be that you send it off and the other person looks at it and say, no, you don't think you can do anymore because there isn't any more to be done. Or you get someone who has feedback. And so that you just go back and forth until everybody reaches the point where it's just it is good as is. And you can go ahead.
Yeah. You already have another book in the pipeline that's coming out a year from now?
It's coming out in autumn 2025. I just got the pub date, but I just realized I don't know if my publisher has given me permission to say that aloud. So I'm just going to leave it there. Autumn 2025. It's not a food book this time. It is a bookstore book set in London. It's kind of like a cross between You've Got Mail and Ted Lasso, and that young, impetuous American comes to work at prestigious, crumbling British institution and butts heads with the very starchy manager, and chaos and delight ensue.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Before we leave The Slowest Burn, though, I have got to ask about the setting. I'm from the Bay Area. Sarah, you're from the Bay Area. You nail the Bay Area. Sometimes I'll read a book and I'm thinking that's not what Sausalito is like. So what was that like, writing about a place, especially because you were living here, but then you weren't living here? What was it about the setting that was important for this story?
I mean, to be fair, I did almost all of the drafting in the Bay Area. So after I moved to London was when I did the last big edit after I gotten my publishing deal. So most of the work was done here. And I think this is a place I feel very comfortable. I lived here for most of my childhood. There's so many different dimensions to it, like life in North Berkeley and a craftsman house.
Which is where Ellie was living. Yeah.
Exactly. Versus Kieran's pretty scuzzy corner of the Mission, where you'd be living in a basement studio and paying through the nose for rent for it. I wanted that cultural stuff. And also it's also just places that I love. I love Berkeley. I went there for college. It's one of my favorite places. I love Sonoma County. If I ever move back to the Bay, I'd love to go live in Sebastopol because it's just one of my favorite places in the world. And Ojai is in Southern California, is where I went to high school because I was a boarding school kid. So it's a part of the world I'm familiar with as well. If it has a strong sense of place, it's just because I have a very strong sense of this place. This is where I'm from. I have California poppies tattooed on me for that reason. I don't think I would write about anywhere else. I wouldn't write about somewhere I hadn't spent a good amount of time, because it's to me, what makes a romance novel really interesting, the central relationship needs to work. That's very true. But what differentiates an all-right romance novel from a great one is all of the background, all the context, the thing that brings the couple together, the people that surround them, the sense of place and where they are. It's a much fuller tapestry as opposed to just paper dolls dancing around.
Right. There's a depth of detail that is based on your own personal experience being there.
Absolutely.
As any good writing, it grounds the writing. And so we believe it.
I'm glad to hear that.
I wanted to go also into just food in fiction, whether it's romance, whether it's mystery, whether it's something that Sally Rooney writes, but I don't really know what her views are on food. And
I don't think her character eats.
See, I don't think there's any. I can't think
well,
they
that's
eat.
okay. Can we talk about that? Because like when we said, certain books get food right and certain books, they kind of phone it in or just ignore it completely. For people who are listening to this podcast who want to write cookbooks or want to write about food, reading fiction can be a really great way to hone your skills and description. Like Sarah, what you were just saying about California. Can we just talk about what role food can play in fiction and where it's a missed opportunity and where it's done really well?
An area that's very comfortable talking about food is there's a lot of children's fiction with food in it that is actually really expressive and really descriptive. And I think it's because when you're a child, you're not as interested in the sort of grand, highfalutin, abstract concepts that you get in most adult literary fiction. So a lot of children's authors are very comfortable in putting food scenes in their fiction. So like one of the things I immediately thought of was the scene with Maple in the Snow in Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder.
I can remember that exactly.
Yeah, you remember that so clearly.
It makes you want to eat snow with maple on it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also, I thought of My Side of the Mountain, which is this sort of kid who decides to go out and live in the woods somewhere in New England, I think. And it talks about all the things he comes up with and what he makes to feed himself, which I'm sure looking back on it is sort of terrifying, but like it was fascinating to read at the time. Also, there's wonderful food scenes in the All of a Kind family series by Sydney Taylor. There's great food scenes in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. So definitely something kids. In terms of adult fiction, I think of like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel is probably the greatest one we've got. It ties food and magical realism together so beautifully. And it's such a delicious book in terms of just food and love and sex. And it's all tangled up together in such a brilliant way.
It's a great list. I feel like I just read a YA book that had a lot of food scenes, and it was sort of a cross-cultural book, and I was struck by it.
Right. I was just thinking, Dial A for Aunties, the very first chapter is basically like this crazy dim sum parlor in San Gabriel Valley, and you just want to be there at the table with the aunties yelling for the best bits of dim sum, and it's pretty phenomenal.
Crazy Rich Asians as well has some amazing eating scenes where they go to Singapore and they're in the night markets eating, and I just see there's like, can I get on the next flight to Singapore, please,
right,
and eat myself to death for the next 24 hours? That sounds amazing. It's not something I think of as much in literary fiction per se, as opposed to commercial fiction. But I think literary fiction has a thing where like joy isn't literary, happiness isn't literary. So if there's stuff to do with food, it's usually tied in with suffering of some kind, which is not ideal, or disordered eating of some variety. So I have a hard time thinking of a literary novel with like big cooking and eating scenes with people taking pleasure in it.
It's interesting. That ties back to what you were saying earlier about going to the writers' workshops that you've been and being not, taken seriously because it was a romance genre and not. And so food is sort of falling into that. It's about pleasure and comfort. And that's not
highbrow enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Morose and tortured to be literary. Interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
No, but I love the point that we can all learn to be better writers by writing about food, just by reading good descriptions of it wherever it may appear.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true in fiction. I would also add poetry is really good to read if you want to have a better handle on how to write evocatively. Like I think of there's pieces of poetry by like Pablo Neruda where he's a very sensual, not like, yes, in the sexy sense, but also in the like enjoying your senses sense.
Yeah.
And I think of like lines he's written to do with eating. Well, women's great for it too. I mean, he even thinks of things like it's quoted within an inch of its life with the Carlos Williams poem about the plums in the icebox.
I immediately thought of coffee and oranges and the cockatoo. And because the orange scene in your book, when Kieran takes his love for cooking back to learning that a mandarin could be used many different ways.
Yes.
To me, there's a certain poetry in that an ingredient, a word can be used in many different ways.
I would argue that oranges are a very poetical fruit in a way. I think it's the kind of like the sense of like there's so much hiding inside this peel, but the peel itself is full of fragrance, and oranges are sweet and sour and bitter at the same time. And there's so many things happening at once. I think about them a lot. Again, writing is personal. I think a lot about oranges.
Yeah. To wrap up our conversation today, I just wanted to ask if there are people listening who are in the nonfiction space, or maybe they're frustrated nonfiction writers, and they want to take a leap into the great unknown of fiction, whether it's romance, whether it's another genre, sci-fi, whatnot. What would you recommend? Where would they start?
I would say read aggressively in your genre.
Aggressively.
Yeah. If you know you have a genre you like, if you're a mystery reader, just go and get as many of them out of the library as you can and just read through them. Like, I'm a romance writer because I was a romance reader first. It's not just to sort of fill your bucket with like all the different stories that can be told. It's also to get a feel for your beats and for what works and what doesn't. And if you read for long enough, you'll kind of intuitively know what actually makes a story good and what doesn't. You'll be able to say like, oh, I can kind of tell that the romance wasn't developed quite right, or like, one of a lot of romance readers' pet peeves is when you have this low moment when it feels like all is lost and the couple have like broken up. Some writers center that around a big misunderstanding or a big miss where there's just a total communication failure. And that can be done well if it's true to sort of the characters' personalities and stuff that's been built in previously. But sometimes it will just come out of nowhere, and the readers will sit there and go like,
couldn't they just text about this?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I was suspending my disbelief, but come on. And if you get your reader going, come on, they're lost. It's done. Read in your genre, and it's like, do it because it's fun. One of the things I really found when I started to write romance was that it was fun to write. I've been watching romantic comedies for years. I had started to read them really intensively. And just being at this point where my characters are fighting with each other and flirting and bantering, it's so fun to write. And it's like, there's no point in jumping into it. You're like, I would like to do this to make money. It's like, no, I'd write this even if I weren't going to make any money off it, because it's just fun to do.
That's really, really important.
It's the best.
Have fun, everyone. And reading is fun. So great assignment. Sarah, this has been so much fun.
Yeah, speaking of fun, this has been really fun and a little different than our usual, but I love it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
This was such a delight. The Slowest Burn is such a fun read.
Yeah. Anyone who likes food, cookbooks, romance, it's a good read.
What I would also throw in is if you've never been a romance reader, but you read any kind of commercial or genre fiction, give it a shot. You might surprise yourself.
Love that.
It's fun.
It's fun. And we should just all have more fun.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available wherever you get your audio, and if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. And thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.